Hi, and welcome to the Igniting Impact podcast brought to you by Public Knowledge. I'm Stacey Moss, and your host and the CEO of our management consulting firm. Our firm's vision is to be a catalyst for change, leaving each person, project, client, colleague, and community better than when we started. Today's conversation focuses on how quality assurance can do far more than monitor project status. When done well, QA provides agencies with independent insights that improve delivery, reduce risk, strengthen decision-making, and support better outcomes, ultimately improving the impact of high-risk technology projects. We are exploring two questions today. How can quality assurance help agencies deliver large initiatives with greater confidence? And two, what makes a QA partnership valuable from an agency perspective regarding high-stakes projects? Today, I'm joined by two guests. We have Tony Sutton, who is an IT program coordinator at ODOT, the Oregon Department of Transportation, and Adam Brown, a longtime management consultant at Public Knowledge. Thank you both for being here with me today. We're going to start with just a little bit about your experience and perspective. And Tony, I'm going to start with you. Organizations engage independent quality assurance for a lot of different reasons, sometimes because it's required and sometimes because they see the value. What factors led ODOT to incorporate QA across its technology initiatives?
I think to help answer this, I should talk about QA involvement before I started working with the state and joining ODOT. Before I joined the state in 2007, I worked for a large Fortune 500 firm, and we would use independent QA in that world very sparingly. It wasn't very often, and when we did, it was mainly about accountability. The QA reports were essentially a way to demonstrate to stakeholders and federal regulators that we were meeting the standards and the requirements that were set forth for our industry. So when I transferred into the state service and encountered my first project that used independent QA, I was actually relieved. I thought, okay, this is good. There is transparency here. There is a willingness to bring in an outside voice, but it didn't take long to realize that the public sector and the private sector had different motivations for using independent QA. Although some were similar, there was definitely not identical. In Oregon, for agencies under the governor's authority, there are really two drivers behind using independent QA. The first one is simply, it's mandated. If a project hits certain thresholds, either based on statewide policy or because of oversight analyst determines the risk level is high enough, the agency really doesn't have a choice. Independent QA becomes a requirement, not a decision. The second driver is more strategic. There are times when an agency chooses to bring in independent QA because it's in the agency's best interest. Over the 14 years that I've been here, I've had three major projects that we've called out ourselves to have independent QA. Each one had its own complexities, but they had one common thread: optics. By engaging independent QA proactively, we were able to surface risks early, show that we were taking them seriously, and demonstrate to leadership and stakeholders that we were actively managing the challenges, not hiding them. So in a nutshell, ODOT uses independent QA is really a blend of compliance and intentional transparency. Some of it is required, but most of the time recently, it's been a strategic choice to strengthen the trust and improve the outcomes of our efforts.
Oh, that background's really helpful. Thanks, Tony. Adam, I'm wondering from your experience with ODOT projects, what separates QA engagements that become trusted partnerships from those that are viewed primarily as simple oversight?
Yeah, I love this question because there's a huge difference in engagements that are those trusted partnerships and that are on the oversight side. I really think the answer is trust. I think when we're able to build that trust, then we have the opportunity to actually provide advice, to have those more honest and open conversations and really make a bigger difference for the project. So trust is huge for me in this work, and I think it makes a huge difference.
So how do you build that trust, Adam?
Yeah. So when I join a new project, a new engagement, I'm actively looking for opportunities to build that trust. And I'm really looking for somebody who's going to hold the door open for me. Like, I think it's our job to earn that trust, to prove that we're worthy of that trust. But I'm looking for a little bit of time from a leader to let me demonstrate that we are those people. And the ways that we do that are really simple. It's like being honest and accurate and fair and respectful. They're like basic things to really just do what say you're going to do and do it in an honest and ethical way.
I love that visual you had of having the client keep the door open for us, right? And then through those actions, that's how we walk through the door of trust. It's a great visual. Well, let's look a little bit at QA in practice. These large initiatives involve a lot of competing priorities, lots of different stakeholders, and constant decision making. And quality assurance can really help leaders with objective oversight and some practical recommendations that help keep that work on track. So for both of you, I'm wondering from your perspective, what are some of the most common issues that QA helps agencies identify early on in a project? And Adam, if you don't mind starting on this, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Some of the things that come to mind for me as coming up very early in projects, resource shortages is an easy first choice there. It's very common, especially at the challenges that agencies are facing today with what they have to deliver and what they have available to deliver that. Complexity and unknowns are another one. And I think a lot of times the projects may be aware of them, but I think we can help sort of put a little bit more around that and think a little bit about but how much does it mean? And does anybody understand it? As individual participants, we may not understand it, but does the team overall or the agency overall understand the complexity around nouns? Another thing that comes up is a due date that may not be able to be met. That's either, especially if it's externally mandated, but they may not know if they can meet it, or they may know that they can't meet it. And I think having us weigh in on that and emphasize that can be helpful. And another one that comes up a little bit slower sometimes is alignment. But I think it's a great one for us because I think a lot of times leaders of a project will believe they have alignment or believe they have a common understanding, but because we're talking to folks regularly and a cross section of folks across the project, we have the opportunity to hear from them directly and hear that they're either all describing it the same, or that they can't describe it, or that they're describing it in really different ways.
That's a great way to help with engagement too. Understanding alignment will lead into that. Tony, any other common issues that you can identify early on?
Yes. Adam actually took a couple of the ones that I was thinking about, which is good. That means that we're on the same page. We've worked together on different efforts for years. So one of the things that is the value when you're talking about independent QA, especially in large initiatives, there are two other areas that basically are not always seen as until they become a problem. And having independent QA be able to bring those to the forefront early really does make a huge difference. And one of the biggest of these areas is one that sometimes we all fall victim to: perceptual blindness. On large efforts, the team gets so locked into the specific pieces of the puzzle that they can't see the whole puzzle. They can't see what's going on around them. And that is not something that they intentionally do. It is just the nature of the results of being deep in the work. And independent QA, being not embedded, but being part of the effort, being able to see what's going on, not in the day-to-day firefighting of the stuff, they're able to bring those things up and bring them to the forefront and catch those blind spots earlier than what we'd be able to as a project team. So that's one of the things that I see. The other one is when you're dealing with initiatives that are multiple initiatives across the agency. And Adam kind of touched on some of that in the perspective. When you don't know what's going on and you face those issues, and if you don't see them, having independent QA bring up where those can cause problems between the two projects, especially if you're using the same independent QA vendor, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on the projects, it can make a huge difference of that interaction. So in short, QA helps the team see what they can't see because we're so far into the weeds. And that kind of perspective helps keep the project from falling behind or facing issues that will be very costly later on in the project.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. This next question is for both of you as well. I'm wondering, how does quality assurance improve visibility and support better decision-making throughout a project? I know you both talked a little bit about visibility, but if you look at decision-making and how do we make better decisions throughout it, how does QA help support that? And either of you can start.
I mean, certainly calling out risks that the project is not aware of helps the project makes better decisions for sure. I also think calling out what people already know on some level can be really helpful. I think sometimes there's the sort of elephant in the room where it's on everybody's minds, but nobody really wants to say it out loud. And I think we sort of help shine the spotlight and get over that hump and call it out so that it makes it easier for others to talk about. I think sometimes it's something that people are sort of vaguely aware of, but haven't really had the time to think through or put words to, or don't know if anybody else is dealing with it. And because we have that like cross-project look, we can provide some insight there. Other times, I think just the language that we come up with, like we try really hard to use fair and accurate language and say things in a way that aren't going to upset anybody. And I think sometimes that gives other participants a framework or language to use to make it easier for them to talk about a sensitive subject too.
Great. Tony, anything to add?
Yeah. Let me share a real life example. And this goes back to what I talked about earlier, a little bit about the cross interaction between initiatives that are being run and that blind spot that QA can help surface. A few years back, I was working on a project where we were replacing our production control system. About 6 months in, we ran into a potential issue. But the key thing is we learned about it early because of independent QA vendor was actually working on both major initiatives. QA flagged that the other project had changed direction and that shift could have a ripple effect on our work and it could affect the way our outcomes. And it wasn't something anyone on our team would have been able to see, at least not any time early into it. Once that showed up in our quarterly report, though, we were able to dig into it, do some more analysis, find out what the actual impact was. And when we didn't get the other team to engage with us to come up with a solution because their idea was, hey, we'll just see how the problem unfolds and we'll move forward from there. We were like, no, we can't do that. And so we were able to use that QA report and the information that they provided to escalate up through management. And then leadership was able to adjust both initiatives in a way that allowed each one to move forward successfully. So that is one of the areas where independent QA really does shine in our areas, is when we have things that are coming up that we have no power to deal with. That independent outside view of it really does help us escalate those things through our leadership.
Probably helps give heft to that conversation too, where yeah, if it was coming from you, but without that other person saying it, it actually makes it easier to talk about and easier to have more attention.
I was just going to say, I jokingly sometimes refer to that as QA as a megaphone, right? Where we can help a project get the attention and support they need to resolve the risks that they're facing.
Yeah, I love that. I love the megaphone. All right. Well, identifying risks is only kind of part of the work or part of the equation. So let's look now about how independent QA creates value for agencies and project teams outside of identifying risks. So Tony, looking across ODOT's major technology initiatives, what outcomes are easier to achieve when an independent QA partner is involved?
When looking across ODOT's major technology initiatives, one of the clearest outcomes that we see from independent QA being involved is a much higher level of transparency. And that isn't just a practical benefit, it is foundational to how government projects need to succeed. And it is something that the governor in Oregon really wants to see more transparency and more information going out there. The project teams that are essentially on these large, fast-moving initiatives are deep into the work, and they get so focused on the deliverables and solving the problems and keeping things moving forward, they don't always see the things that are coming up, as we talked about before. And being able to get that information from an independent QA and being able to provide it not just to the project, but to leadership really is essential in that transparency. And it helps to create an opportunity to fix those issues as we move forward. So I'd say the outcome you really see when independent QA is part of the process is improved visibility, better decision making, and a smoother coordination across the efforts that we have running in our agency. And then the team can be more responsive and proactive with leadership and the stakeholders based on the information that is provided from that external QA.
Adam, I wanted to talk about trust again. You talked about kind of how you build trust with project teams, but I'm wondering how you build trust and credibility with the leadership as well, the leadership that's kind of above that project team.
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, the things that I do to build trust, I think are foundational, I'll say, and apply to both teams and leadership. I think it's our responsibility to demonstrate that we're worthy of that trust. And I think there's a little bit of like humbleness in that helps earn people's trust, frankly. But the things that I do and encourage folks to do is to be fair and factual and accurate. I think showing respect for everyone involved, their time and the impacts of our work on their careers, I think matters. Like that is potentially could have a large impact on somebody. And I think we need to remember that and understand that and show that we understand that. I think looking for ways to be helpful, again, sort of that difference between just the reporting versus adding value. Looking for ways to actually help is an ongoing part of our work, at least the way we do it. I think part of our job is being prepared to answer questions, but if we don't know, I think having the confidence to say, I don't know, and actually go find out and follow up with folks, I think is a great trust builder. People know, right? If you're trying to make something up or sell them a story or whatever, I think people know. And I think saying, I want to check with my team first, or I believe it's this, but let me look into that for you. And then following up, I think is big. And I think leaders sometimes ask for our input on something, which I love, because then it gives me the chance to either answer their question or find out for them. Right. So that's again, another door that they're opening for me to earn their trust is when they ask us for something. And I encourage them to do that. I ask, is there anything else you want to hear from us about? Is there anything you want us looking into? I think, again, looking for those opportunities to earn that trust is big for us.
Yeah, all of those are great ways to build trust with everyone, right? It's such a good reminder about how to focus on trust and relationships. Thanks, Adam. Let's look now at kind of how QA can improve governance, communication, and accountability. And Tony, I'm going to start with you. I'm wondering about if you can think about a project that involves multiple stakeholders, how QA helps keep communication and expectations aligned.
When we're working on these projects with a lot of stakeholders, different teams, leadership groups, vendors, keeping everyone aligned can be one of the hardest parts for any project. That's where independent QA can also shine, is their transparency engine. I mean, it creates a shared understanding of what's actually happening inside the project and points out when there are problems, potential problems, and problems that we're working on. Every government initiative, whether it is technology, modernization, or service delivery upgrades, is funded by the public. That means that accountability is not just for what we're delivering, but it is how we deliver it. And stakeholders need to know their investment is being managed responsibly and the decisions are happening and they're not in a vacuum. QA helps that process to make sure that by providing that unbiased look at the progress and what's going on and the risks and issues, to make sure that transparency is there. So in short, independent QA keeps communication aligned by keeping everything out there in the open and putting it in reports that that are coming not from the team, they're coming from an unbiased source that is outside of our control. And that is absolutely essential for transparency.
I love that you brought up, using public funds and taxpayer money, because we also, since we work with public sector all the time, always think about how we're good stewards, right, of those monies and that time. I'm glad you brought that up. Adam, I'm wondering what approaches we use to help kind of turn observations into actual practical recommendations that leaders and project teams can apply and act on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps folks act quickly on the things that we're learning and seeing is frequent conversations. If I have an opportunity to talk with my client regularly, I can raise things that we're hearing about long before it appears in a report. They can learn about things nearly as early as we do. Sometimes before we even know if it's a risk, before we've decided. It's a sort of an emerging topic that we can talk through with them. And I love when I have that kind of access, with leaders have that kind of time to share with me so that we can provide those insights really early and quickly, but they don't always. And so getting time with folks is a bit of a fine line for us to walk, because we have a lot of very busy clients and we love to have their time so that we can contribute, but also don't want to take too much of it because they have plenty of other things to keep them busy too.
Yeah, that's a tightrope that we play all the time. All right. Well, I wanted to take a look at one of the projects that you guys have going right now, the Crash Data System Replacement Project. From what I understand, that's a project that's kind of currently en route, but not completely finalized. And so a question for both of you, if you look at its current stage, what benefits have emerged from having independent QA partner involved in this project?
Yeah, it's a great question because the Crash Data System Replacement Project is also in an interesting phase right now. We've selected an application vendor and we're deep into months of negotiation. And normally during that stage, this is when many of the business folks and people that are involved with the project wonder, do we still really need independent QA at this point? But the value that QA brings right now isn't as much in the traditional risk and tracking. It's more, as Adam was saying earlier, about aligning our expectations within the effort. Larger initiatives like Crash Data System Replacement come with a big cast of stakeholders. As we've talked about before, keeping those stakeholders involved and understanding what's going on and having that transparency sometimes can be difficult. And when you have program teams, IT teams, leadership, vendors, other outside partners, and even in this case, federal agencies that are involved, it's really essential to have that transparency and that documentation that can back up what's going on and can describe where there may be risks or issues that also need to be brought to the front. And that alignment. When you have that many voices, though, with many different perspectives, it's increasingly easy for each group to build its own vision of what's happening. One team may think that the timeline is solid, another team may see delays that because the information that they're getting, leadership may assume that there are certain risks or things are under control, and then suddenly everything's misaligned and you've got to try to fix that. That's one of those things, aligning those expectations and documenting it really does help when you're dealing with independent QA because they cut through that and they provide that neutral fact-based view of the project and where it's at within that. So this phase of it it's really important that they're involved. And honestly, at this stage, that's the real benefit for us with independent QA is being able to help us align that expectations so that decisions can be made it's not made in a vacuum and help build that team momentum that'll carry us into the next phase of our effort. So
that's great. Adam, any that you would add?
No, I really agree with everything Tony's saying, but I also have to say, I love how much we're talking about alignment here today as part of QA. I think it's true and also one of the things that's less commonly discussed as a QA benefit, right? You don't see that in an RFP. You don't see that in proposal responses. I think it speaks to the softer benefits of QA. So I love that it's coming out in this conversation.
Yeah, alignment and governance both have come up, which is great.
Yeah. I mean, again, being able to talk to those different groups directly and then say, our individual interviews are confidential, but to be able to say to leadership, hey, I don't think this message is making it all the way to some of these groups. And so they can actually make some targeted corrections, I think is a great benefit to having us around.
All right. So I'm curious what your advice would be for a state agency who's listening but has never used quality assurance. It's not required in their state, but they're considering it. What advice would you give them?
I've actually talked to other states, and when I've talked to those other agencies about independent QA, their first piece of advice I give them is don't assume. Don't assume you don't need it. Don't assume that it won't add value. And definitely don't assume that past practices are good enough for what you're doing today. Technology changes. Our practices need to change. We need to stay up on things. And every organization has its own history, moments where impartial voice could have helped or would have mitigated an issue that could have become a more full-blown issue that you don't want to deal with in your agency. That may sound familiar that, take independent QA seriously and try it. What I usually suggest is starting small, but strategic. Pick one or two high profile initiatives, projects that they have a lot of visibility or carry significant risk to the agency or department, and bring independent QA into those efforts. Reach out to other agencies, reach out to myself or others that have worked with independent QA in the past so that we can help you work around some of the pitfalls, understand some of the best practices, some contracting approaches that may be available, all the real world details that make the difference between simply using QA and actually getting value out of it. But the biggest thing I tell people is don't ignore it. the need just because you've never done it before. Government projects are complex, and being proactive is almost always cheaper and easier than cleaning up a mess after the fact. At the end of the day, we're stewards of public resources. We have an obligation to be transparent, to operate above board, and to show stakeholders that we're making thoughtful, responsible decisions. Independent QA helps us document that process more than anything.
Adam, any advice that you would offer to other states that are considering QA?
I would suggest have a plan to make your QA provider a partner. Use them as a benefit for the project, not just for that outside reporting piece. And I think if you don't know how to do that, that's okay, but engage your QA provider in doing that. You can figure it out together. I think if you come in with that sort of they're just for outside reporting or they're just some other specific piece, you're making it much harder for me to find ways to be helpful, which is what I want to be doing, right? If we're there because you have to have somebody, great, but let's figure out how to get the most value out of us to help the project as much as we can and pick somebody you can work with. I mean, in an ideal setting, this is somebody you're talking to about the hardest things about your project, the hardest things at work. So pick somebody that you can work with and you can build that trust with.
Yeah, so important. All right, looking at some myths and misconceptions, wondering what some of the biggest myths and misconceptions that agencies may have about QA. You have any?
I have some guesses, but I can't wait to hear what Tony has to say about this.
Well, one of the biggest misconceptions agencies have about quality assurance is the idea that QA is contracted by the agency. They're someone that's supposed to do and align with what the agency wants. And really, the whole value of QA comes from the fact that they don't operate inside of the project bubble. The project teams are naturally focused on the process, like we talked about before, and they are independent. That's the key thing. They're independent and objective. So they give insight that is credible because they're not under the control of the agency. Yes, there is a contract. Yes, they have certain deliverables. But when they're putting those things together and they're documenting what is going on within the project, the nature of a project to focus on what is going on and to control the narrative, QA isn't part of that control. And so you want that independent QA to be able to give the bigger picture and be objective and give the evidence that are necessary. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions, is that they're another contractor and they just need to do what we tell them to do. And yes, they do have to supply the deliverables, but what they put in those should be a realistic look. And for it to be something that is of any value, it needs to be unbiased and it needs to be from their perspective. So it can point out the blind spots that we have.
Yeah, and there's systems in place to help us stay independent too, right? Other roles that sort of watch that to help make sure that happens.
Yes, within the state of Oregon there are, but some of the states I've talked to, they don't have those controls.
Adam, any other myths or misconceptions?
I mean, my fear is that some of the misconceptions are that we're gonna embarrass people, that we're gonna pick on them or grill them and embarrass them and somehow endanger their reputations or careers. That's sort of my fear, that people worry about that.
That's a good one.
We try pretty hard to not be that, and I don't think we are that.
Yeah, exactly. No surprises. I think we talk about that a lot. No surprises. I know, Adam, you talked a little bit about, making sure that state agencies pick a partner that they can trust and that they can work with. But I'm wondering what leaders should look for in order to find that valuable, trusted partnership from a QA provider. As they're evaluating who that is, and this is for both of you, but as they're evaluating who would be a great partner, what should leaders look for?
When leaders are trying to get real value out of independent QA partnership, there are a few key things that they should be looking for. And they all come down to the purpose of QA. What's the objective, insight, clarity, and alignment? First, leaders, and we've talked about this before in this podcast, first, leaders should look for true independence. If the QA feels pressured to match the project narrative or soften its findings, the value disappears. You want a partner who's not influenced by deliverable deadlines, internal politics, assumptions about the project should be going. Their job is to tell you actually what's happening, not what the team is hoping is going on. Second, leadership should expect clear evidence-based reporting. Good QA doesn't just point out risk. It explains them in context, shows why they matter, and often gives you practical remedies or recommendations. It helps everyone from staff to executives understand the same picture based on the facts rather than interpretations. Third, a strong QA partner should help with expectation alignment. And we talked about this before. It is a very strong thing, and I've seen it across many of the efforts that we have. Big initiatives naturally accumulate multiple versions of the truth. One group thinks that the timeline is solid, another thinks it's slipping. Leadership assumes things. QA cuts through all that noise. It creates one shared understanding that leaders should look at for a QA team that brings that clarity, not just to the problems, but to the communication that's necessary for that clarity. Fourth, looking for a QA partner who understands the value of transparency. Especially in government work, transparency isn't an option. It's how we maintain trust with the stakeholders, outside governing bodies, and the public. QA should make it easier for everyone to see what's working, what's not, and how the team is responding to that. And finally, leadership should look for a QA partner who is proactive, not just reactive. The best QA teams don't wait for something to break. They help anticipate issues, test assumptions, and surface blind spots early. They keep the project grounded before change turns into crisis. So if leadership is focused on independence, clarity, transparency, alignment, and forward-looking insight, they get the full value out of that QA partnership.
That's a tremendous list. I love it. And it's a very good summary of kind of all the conversations that we've had today. Thank you, Tony. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together today. I just want to thank you both for your insights and your time and sharing your experience today with our listeners. It's been a privilege to be here with you today, to connect, to learn, to grow, to breathe, and to share. Until next time.